Have you ever wondered how far a dog's loyalty can stretch? Can a Labrador retriever's heart truly wait for years? Well, one did. It all started with a simple, yet heart-wrenching moment. A moment that would change both the dog and his owner's lives forever. As the Labrador retriever stood at the doorstep, tail wagging in pure excitement, his owner knelt down, whispered soft words of reassurance, and patted his head. "I'll be back soon, buddy," the owner said. But the dog couldn't comprehend the weight of those words. The moment the door clicked shut behind his owner, the dog felt something shift. His excitement turned to confusion. The usual routine was shattered. Why hadn't his owner come back to take him for their usual walk? Why wasn't he there to feed him? The dog trotted around, sniffing the air, his nose desperately searching for any trace of the familiar scent. He waited by the door, ears perked up, eyes wide in anticipation, but his owner didn't return. Then came the moment when the dog was ushered into a strange, sterile world, the airport. He was alone now, the wide, cold expanse of terminal floors stretching out before him, a place so unfamiliar, so alien. There was no one familiar, no warm hand to stroke his fur. He felt the coldness of his surroundings seep deep into his bones, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, his owner. The minutes ticked by. The dog's heart beat faster as he scanned every passing face, hoping to see the one person who had always been there for him. But time dragged on, and the doors remained closed. His owner was nowhere to be found. What was happening? The dog stood by the entrance, his paws now aching from standing too long, but he couldn't move. He just knew his owner would be walking through those doors at any moment, and he refused to leave. But the door didn't open. The dog's world shifted from confusion to heartbreak. He wasn't just waiting for a walk or a snack. He was waiting for something far more important, the love of his life, his protector, his best friend. It was a promise his owner had made, and he clung to it like nothing else mattered. And so he waited. He waited with a heart full of hope, but there was a question he couldn't ask. Why had his owner left him behind? The clock ticked, but to the dog, time was an unrelenting force, pushing him deeper into the unknown. His instincts told him to stay, to search, to find. And so, with a loyal heart that knew no limits, the Labrador retriever began his journey, alone, yet filled with the unwavering belief that his owner would return. The moment the doors closed behind his owner, the Labrador retriever's world shifted. The soft sound of footsteps faded into the distance, and a sense of confusion swept over him. What was happening? His owner had never left him like this before. He had always been there, calling him with a smile, taking him on walks, feeding him treats, and giving him all the love he could possibly ask for. But now, there was only emptiness. The dog stood frozen for a moment, as if expecting the door to open again and his owner to walk through. But it didn't. He tilted his head, ears perked up, and his tail gave an anxious twitch. No familiar scent lingered in the air, only the sterile, cold smells of the airport. Desperation set in. He started pacing, sniffing every corner, trying to understand. Where was his owner? Why hadn't he come back yet? He darted towards the large glass doors, his paws clicking against the smooth tile floor. He tried to peer through them, but they were just too high. He couldn't see past the reflective surface, just his own confused reflection staring back at him. With every passing moment, his hope started to dim, but he refused to believe it. He had to find him. Maybe his owner had just gone to get something, or perhaps he was waiting just outside. The dog began running down the corridor, sniffing every person he passed, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, each stranger unfamiliar. He tugged at their sleeves, his tail wagging hopefully, but no one looked down in recognition. No one cared for the anxious, pleading eyes of a dog desperate for his owner's return. The dog's pace quickened, now running full speed through the terminal, slipping through gaps, darting between travelers, his fur brushing against the sides of chairs and walls. He went down every hallway, checked every nook, and circled around luggage belts, every movement driven by the single thought in his mind: find his owner. The airport became a labyrinth, vast and endless, full of people who walked past him as if he was invisible. Each moment he spent searching felt like hours, his heart beating faster, his hope dwindling, but never fully fading. He didn't understand why his owner wasn't there anymore. He couldn't grasp the concept of departure, but his instincts knew one thing: his owner had to be somewhere. and until he found him, he wouldn't stop. As the hours stretched into a painful silence, the dog's frantic search began to slow. He had checked every corner, every terminal, every hallway. He had sniffed every bag, pawed at every person who walked past, hoping that one of them would recognize him. But none did. His owner's scent had disappeared, and with each passing second, his confusion turned into a cold, sharp realization. His owner wasn't coming back. The soft hum of the airport's overhead lights was the only sound that filled the air now, and the dog stood frozen in the middle of the terminal. His ears drooped, and his once bright, hopeful eyes began to dull with uncertainty. Where had his owner gone? Why wasn't he coming back? The first night alone was the hardest. The terminal was quiet, almost eerie in its emptiness. The dog wandered back to the doors where his owner had walked out earlier, his paws clicking against the cold floor, as if that sound would somehow summon the familiar face he desperately wanted to see. But the doors stayed closed. The lights flickered above him, casting long shadows across the floor. He sat there, his back pressed against the door, head tilted as he looked up at the darkening sky outside. There was no one. And then, the howling started. It wasn't loud at first, just a low whimper that rose from deep within his chest. The pain of abandonment and confusion spilled out in soft cries, but no one came to comfort him. No one noticed the dog, who was so desperately trying to make sense of the strange world around him. As the night grew colder, the dog began pacing, his steps quick and nervous, back and forth over the same spot where he had waited. He walked, his body tense with worry, his mind racing. He couldn't settle. Every time he stopped, his eyes would flick to the doors, hoping to see his owner return, but each time the doors remained closed. His heart sank a little more with every failed attempt. The air around him felt thicker now, heavier with the weight of loneliness. The dog's whimpers turned to soft barks, desperate sounds that echoed through the empty halls. His longing and confusion consumed him. He couldn't understand why his owner was gone, or why he hadn't come back. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but still, the dog refused to believe it. His owner would return. He had to. Exhausted from his pacing and howling, the dog eventually curled up by the doors, unable to keep his eyes open any longer. His body shivered from the cold, but his mind stayed alert, still waiting, still hoping. The first night alone was filled with questions he couldn't answer. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, the only thing that kept him going was the sliver of hope that one day, his owner would walk through those doors and take him home. Following morning, as the first rays of light filtered through the airport's windows, the dog's restless pacing was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Airport staff, noticing the persistent presence of the stray dog, approached cautiously, muttering amongst themselves. The dog had been wandering for hours now, and his frantic, confused behavior was impossible to ignore. They knew they couldn't leave him there. He was a potential liability for the airport. They had to catch him. The dog, however, was no ordinary stray. His instinct to stay free, to continue his search, overpowered any concern for his own safety. As the airport workers moved closer, he froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He could feel their eyes on him, but he had no intention of being caught. His mind, clouded with desperation to find his owner, saw the workers as obstacles in his path, not as helpers. As one of the staff members reached for him, the dog bolted. His speed was shocking. He darted to the left, his paws slapping against the hard tile floor, and in a flash he was gone, weaving between travelers who barely had time to react. The workers rushed after him, but he was faster, more determined. It was as if he had learned the layout of the airport, knowing exactly where to run and where to hide. He knew the security areas, the narrow corridors, and the dark corners where he could slip away and disappear. The workers tried again, this time blocking his path with barriers. But the dog was a blur, dodging and weaving with the agility of a creature who had nothing to lose. One staff member lunged at him, his hands reaching out in a final desperate attempt. But the dog managed to slip past, his body twisting out of the way just in time. He wasn't just fast, he was clever. Every time they tried to corner him, he found a way to break free. Each escape was a victory, not just for the dog's survival, but for his spirit. With each narrow miss, he grew bolder, running faster, thinking sharper. The airport workers became more frustrated, but the dog remained unfazed, his eyes never losing their focus. The dog knew that he couldn't stop now. He couldn't let anyone, get in the way of his quest to find the one person he still believed would come for him. He kept escaping, his hope driving him forward, knowing that freedom and the search for his owner were intertwined. Days bled into weeks, and the airport, with its cold, indifferent walls, became the dog's world. At first, the dog had been driven by pure instinct. He hadn't eaten for hours, perhaps days, and his hunger gnawed at him. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, he adapted. His sharp nose led him to food, scavenged from unsuspecting travelers or left behind by airport workers in haste. A piece of sandwich here, a dropped bag of chips there. He would wait patiently, eyes locked onto the food, moving with stealth and precision, snatching what he could. His body was growing thinner, weaker from the lack of proper nourishment. His fur, once glossy and thick, had become matted and dirty, reflecting the harshness of life at the airport. But through it all, his eyes, the one part of him that remained unchanged, never lost their spark. They were filled with hope, still searching, still waiting, as if they were calling out to his owner, wherever he was. Survival was no longer just about food. It was about figuring out where to hide, when to run, and when to stay still. His instincts sharpened. He knew when the airport was busiest and when it was quiet enough to slip unnoticed into different corners of the terminal. He found places to sleep where he could curl up in safety, hiding in shadows and behind crates when airport security was near. He became a ghost in the airport, a blur of yellow fur seen only when he chose to be seen. But survival wasn't just physical. Every day, the dog continued to search, scanning every face in the crowd for a sign of his owner. It became a part of his routine, sniffing at every suitcase, following every traveler, and sometimes even stopping to peer into the windows of nearby shops, hoping, wishing for a familiar face to appear. With each passing day, his hunger for food was matched only by his hunger for his owner. The emptiness inside him grew as the weeks dragged on. His body was weakening, but his spirit refused to give in. He had survived this long. He could survive a little longer, he told himself. No matter how hard it got, the dog kept moving, always hoping, always searching. His instincts were sharp, but his heart was sharper. And every time he found a piece of food, he told himself that this was just another small victory on the long road to finding the one person who would make everything right again. As the weeks dragged on, the dog's presence at the airport became less of a nuisance and more of a quiet, unwavering reality. The airport workers, once determined to catch him, started to notice something different about the yellow Labrador retriever. His movements, though desperate, showed a strange kind of determination. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly, he was searching for something, or rather someone, and his determination struck a chord with the workers. It wasn't long before they began to soften. They saw how the dog managed to outwit the security measures, his cleverness in avoiding capture, and his resilience. Every day, the dog would slip past them, sometimes through tight spaces, sometimes by darting under their legs as they tried to block him. He never gave up, never stopped hoping. His unshakable belief that his owner would return made him more than just a stray. He was a symbol of loyalty, a reminder of love that wouldn't fade no matter how much time passed. Among the workers, one man, in particular, couldn't shake the image of the dog. His heart softened every time he saw the Labrador's eyes searching the faces of passing travelers, every time the dog's tail wagged, in the hope that someone would stop and pet him. This worker, a middle-aged man named Daniel, began to feel a bond growing. The dog's struggle mirrored his own in many ways. Life hadn't been easy for Daniel, and he, too, had spent years searching for something he couldn't find. Daniel began bringing food for the dog when no one was looking. Bits of sandwich crusts, snacks that were left behind, even his own lunch if he thought no one would notice. At first, the dog eyed him with suspicion, as if unsure whether to trust the food, but hunger always overpowered caution. Slowly, Daniel and the dog formed an unspoken understanding. The dog knew that this man meant no harm. Daniel would often crouch down, extending a hand with a piece of food, and the dog would nudge forward tentatively, accepting it. There were no words exchanged, only the quiet comfort of companionship in the midst of uncertainty. For Daniel, these secret moments became something he looked forward to, a small but meaningful connection in his otherwise monotonous days. The dog was no longer just a stray, he was a friend, a reminder that even in the cold, sterile world of the airport, there could still be kindness and hope. And as he continued to feed the dog, Daniel found himself wondering about the dog's story, wondering where his owner was and why the dog had been left behind. It was a question that haunted him, and the more he saw the dog's determination, the more he felt compelled to help. The airport became a battlefield for the dog, a place where hope and frustration collided every single day. Despite the growing number of attempts by airport staff to catch him, the dog never lost his resolve. His eyes, filled with an unspoken promise, remained fixed on the doors and the people who passed by. Each day he returned to the same places, right by the gates, near the luggage carousel, and by the tarmac where planes came and went. His routine had become predictable to the workers, but they could never catch him, no matter how many times they tried. There was a particular spot just outside the jet bridge where the dog would wait. His nose would twitch, his ears perked up as a new plane landed or took off. He would sniff the ground, trying to catch a scent that might lead him to his owner. Sometimes he would bark, as though calling out for someone, but no one ever came. Passengers would pass by him, too caught up in their own world to notice the dog's desperate search. Yet, the dog never gave up. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that his owner was out there somewhere, just a flight away. And so, he kept sniffing, following the trail of every plane that landed, every suitcase that was carried through the terminal. He watched the passengers disembark, hoping just once to see that familiar face, his owner's face, emerge from the crowd. Sometimes, he'd spot a man with a similar build or a bag that looked familiar, and his heart would race. His body would tense, and he would rush towards the person, only to be disappointed as they walked right past, completely unaware of the dog's longing. The airport staff, frustrated by his persistence, would try to catch him again, but each time, the dog found a new way to escape. Whether it was slipping through a small gap between security barriers or darting under a baggage cart, the dog always managed to evade capture. The workers began to realize there was no stopping him. They couldn't force him to leave, just as they couldn't stop him from hoping. Every time a plane took off, the dog would watch it disappear into the sky, his eyes tracing its path, thinking that his owner might be on it. No matter how many failed attempts he made, no matter how many times he was let down, the dog's resolve never faltered. He would always be there, at the same spot, waiting for a miracle that might one day bring his owner back. As the months turned into years, the airport that once felt like a strange new world began to feel like home to the dog. But home came at a price. The dog had grown older, his once vibrant coat now matted and ragged from the harsh elements of airport life. His muscles, once strong and lean, had become thin and weak from the endless days of searching and surviving. Yet, despite the toll on his body, the fire in his eyes never dimmed. He had seen many seasons pass. The bustling crowds of travelers changed, the planes came and went, but the dog remained, always in the same spots, always searching. His fur, once glossy and thick, now hung in tangled clumps, and his once bright eyes had a duller sheen. The dog's movements had slowed, his pace more measured as age began to wear him down. But still, he never stopped hoping. The airport staff watched him closely, many of them now familiar with his routine. They saw how he still paced by the gates, still sniffed the air whenever a plane arrived, and how he would follow anyone who resembled his owner. They saw the tiredness in his legs, the slow dragging of his body as he walked, but they also saw the unwavering determination in his gaze. It was as if he refused to let time defeat him, as if he knew that his owner would return. The dog's body may have grown weaker, but his heart had never been stronger. There were moments when he could barely stand, when the cold nights left him shivering under the terminal benches. But in those moments of vulnerability, his eyes would still scan the crowd, still search for that one face he had not forgotten. His tail, though slower to wag, would twitch slightly when a man in a leather jacket walked past, or when a suitcase rolled by that reminded him of the one his owner had once carried. But despite all the years that had passed, Despite the wariness that had seeped deep into his bones, the dog never gave up. The longing in his eyes never faded. There was a quiet resolve, a belief that no matter how much time had passed, his owner would come back for him. He was sure of it, and as long as that certainty lived in his heart, the dog would continue to wait, continue to search, no matter how old or frail he became. As the years dragged on, the airport staff had become increasingly frustrated with the dog's persistence. What had started as a minor inconvenience grew into a constant challenge. The dog had outsmarted them time and time again, slipping through their hands, finding ways to evade capture that no one could have anticipated. The airport administration, seeing the situation get out of control, made a decision to step up their efforts. New security measures were put in place, more officers were assigned to patrol the terminal, and additional barriers were erected in an attempt to corral the dog. They even brought in specialized animal control officers, hoping that they could finally capture him. But the dog, his fur graying at the edges and his body thinner from years of survival, was not the same animal they had first encountered. Time had made him sharper, more elusive, and he seemed to understand the airport better than anyone. Every new strategy the airport used only made the dog more resourceful. When they put up gates to block his usual path, he learned how to squeeze through narrow spaces. When they started using leashes and traps, he swiftly ran behind columns or hid under luggage carts, making it impossible for anyone to grab him. His agility had only increased. He had become a master of his surroundings, and the workers had no idea how to handle him. It was as if the dog knew what was coming before they even made their move. He'd watch as the officers marched past, pretending to be uninterested. But the moment they tried to corner him, he was gone. One worker would lunge for him, and the dog would slip under their hands, darting between legs and disappearing into the crowd. Another worker would chase after him, but the dog always managed to find an escape route. He was like a shadow, always one step ahead. The more the airport staff tried, the more frustrated they became. They couldn't trap the dog. They couldn't even get close enough to touch him. Every failed attempt seemed to fuel the dog's determination even more. To him, every new barrier was just another challenge to overcome, another hurdle that stood between him and the one thing he still believed in, his owner's return. And so, the dog continued his mission, knowing the airport staff would never catch him. He would always be one step ahead, and as long as he had hope in his heart, he would keep running, slipping through their grasp and waiting for that one moment, the moment he would be reunited with the person he loved more than anything. The days began to blur together, and with each passing moment, the dog's heart grew heavier. His body had become thinner, his legs slower, and yet his resolve was as strong as ever. Every morning, without fail, he would find his way back to the spot near the tarmac, where planes landed, and he would wait. He could feel it in his bones, the moment when a plane touched down. His instincts told him that this could be the one, the flight that would finally bring his owner home. Every time a plane descended, his heart would race. His eyes would scan the passengers, his tail wagging with anticipation, though his body remained still. He would watch, every muscle tensed, as the airplane came closer to the runway. The ground would tremble, and he would feel it, a magnetic pull to the gate, to the place where travelers would step off, unaware of the dog who had been waiting for years. And then, the plane would touch down. With a burst of energy, the dog would sprint toward the plane, as if the very ground beneath his feet could carry him closer to his owner. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as he ran, his paws slapping against the cold tarmac. The workers would shout, the staff would try to intercept him, but the dog's focus was fixed on the plane, on the chance that the person he longed for might step off and into his life again. As the doors to the plane opened, the dog's eyes widened, his body poised to leap forward. He watched as the passengers started to disembark, one by one. His eyes darted from face to face, looking for any sign of his owner. His nose would twitch, trying to catch a scent, his ears straining to hear a voice, but every time it was the same. The faces that emerged were unfamiliar. The scent was wrong. His heart would sink as another hope slipped away, like sand through his paws. The disappointment hit him hard, a wave of hopelessness crashing over him every time. But there was no time for despair. The dog knew that he couldn't stop now, not when his owner was still out there somewhere. Every plane, every disembarking passenger was a reminder that he had to keep searching, that he had to keep waiting. With a final glance at the empty gate, the dog would turn, his steps slow but purposeful, ready to begin the search all over again. He couldn't afford to give in to the crushing sadness that threatened to pull him under. His owner was out there. He just had to find him. As the years went by, the dog's resilience and survival instincts became sharper, more refined. The airport, once an unfamiliar maze, had become his territory. He had learned its rhythms, its ebbs and flows, and now he moved through it like a ghost, silent, unnoticed, a part of the very fabric of the airport. He knew the schedules of the planes better than the workers themselves. He knew when the terminal was busiest, when the staff would be distracted, and when he had just enough time to slip through the cracks and evade detection. His days had fallen into a rhythm of his own. Each morning, as the sun's first rays touched the cold airport floor, the dog would begin his rounds. He moved with purpose, as if he had a set route to follow, yet his movements were as fluid as water, adapting to the ever-changing environment. He knew where to hide when the security officers patrolled, finding nooks and crannies to squeeze into, behind luggage carts, under benches, or even between thick columns where the shadows were deep and the workers' eyes would miss him. He had become a master of stealth, always one step ahead, always aware of his surroundings. The dog's body, though thinner than it once was still strong, and his movements were swift and sure. He knew the quiet corners where he could rest when he needed to, places where he could curl up and be forgotten by the busy travelers around him. When the airport staff set up new barriers, he would find a way around them. A gap here, a crack there. It was as if the airport had become a game, and he was always winning. He also knew exactly where to go for food. Some airport workers, noticing his persistence, would leave scraps behind, sandwich wrappers, bits of fruit, or empty snack containers, and the dog had learned to find them, often before anyone else did. It wasn't much, but it was enough. His survival was no longer dependent on others. He was self-sufficient, living off the scraps of a world that barely acknowledged him. The dog had transformed from a frightened, confused animal into a clever survivor. His hunger for food was matched only by his hunger for the one thing he still hoped for, a reunion with his owner. Every day, he became more and more invisible to the people around him. He was no longer just a stray dog wandering the terminal. He was the airport's silent, unnoticed fixture, always watching, always waiting, always hoping. The world around him moved on, but he stayed, waiting for the day when his owner would finally come home. The airport had become a place of routine for the dog, his days marked by the slow passage of time, the cycles of flights, and the endless stream of strangers. Yet despite the passage of seasons and years, the dog's hope never faltered. He continued to believe that one day, his owner would return. His eyes, though weary from years of searching, were always scanning the crowd, always on the lookout for that one familiar face. Then, one day, it happened. The dog, as always, sat at his usual spot near the gates, his body tired but his spirit unwavering. His eyes followed the figures passing by, his tail flicking slightly at the sight of each new traveler. And then, there it was, a figure in a dark coat, walking briskly through the terminal. The man's height, his stride, everything about him seemed to match the dog's memories of his owner. The dog's heart skipped a beat, his body tensed, his fur bristling with excitement. Could it be him? Could this finally be the moment? The dog's legs began to move before his mind could fully catch up. He was up and running, pushing through the crowd, his paws hitting the floor with urgency. His heart raced as he barreled forward, his eyes fixed on the figure ahead. He was so close to the one person he had been waiting for all these years. His mind was consumed with one thought. This is it. He's finally here. But as the dog drew nearer, the figure turned, and the reality hit him. It wasn't his owner. The man's face was unfamiliar, his movements strange to the dog. The disappointment was like a physical blow. The dog skidded to a stop, confusion and heartbreak flooding his chest. He stared at the man, his body frozen in place. The stranger walked on, oblivious to the dog's anguish. The dog stood there, stunned for a moment, trying to make sense of the wave of emotions crashing over him. It wasn't his owner. It wasn't the reunion he had longed for. But something inside him sparked again. He's out there. That brief glimmer of hope, no matter how fleeting, reignited the fire inside the dog. His owner was still out there, and he wasn't going to stop until he found him. With a determined shake of his head, the dog turned back to his spot by the gates, his eyes scanning once more. The confusion had passed, replaced now by a more powerful resolve. He would keep searching, keep waiting, because this time, he knew his owner was closer than ever. As the dog continued his endless vigil at the airport, something strange began to catch the attention of the airport staff. The workers, who had grown accustomed to the dog's presence, started to notice a peculiar pattern in his behavior. It wasn't just random wandering anymore. The dog had begun to follow certain planes, his movements deliberate, his eyes locked onto specific flights. He would hover near the gates where certain flights landed, then slip past the barriers and sneak closer when those planes disembarked. His pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. The staff, initially dismissing the dog as a nuisance, started to grow curious. They observed him for days, watching his every move as he repeated the same behavior, seemingly drawn to specific planes. It didn't matter which airline or what time of day, the dog was always at the gate just before certain flights landed. He seemed to know when a plane was due to arrive, and every time, he would stand still, his nose twitching as the aircraft descended, his eyes narrowing with anticipation. One of the workers, a young man named Mike, began to wonder if the dog might have some connection to the passengers on those flights. Could the dog somehow be tracking his owner's scent? The idea seemed ridiculous at first. How could a dog know the specific planes his owner might be on? Yet, the pattern was undeniable. Mike had seen the dog get close to passengers before, sniffing their bags or trailing behind them, but there had never been any clear explanation for why he followed some planes more than others. Mike began to pay closer attention, taking notes of the flights the dog followed most often. His suspicions grew. There was something more to this than mere coincidence. The dog had an uncanny way of zeroing in on the right planes. Could it be possible that the dog had an extraordinary sense, something beyond the ordinary, guiding him toward his owner? Mike wasn't sure, but the possibility gnawed at him. Perhaps the dog wasn't just aimlessly wandering. Perhaps he was trying to tell them something. Mike shared his thoughts with a few of the other workers, but none of them could explain it. All they knew was that the dog had become a part of the airport's daily rhythm, an enigma they couldn't ignore. And now, as the dog continued to follow his own secret path, the staff began to wonder, was the dog really tracking something? Was he getting closer to finding his owner, or was it all just an illusion? The mystery deepened, and the anticipation in the air grew heavier with every passing day. Years had passed since the dog first wandered into the airport, and with each season, his body had begun to show the toll of time. His once thick, golden fur had become thin and wiry, matted in places from the harsh conditions. His movements were slower now, his legs aching from the constant strain of endless searching. Every step was a reminder that age had caught up with him, that his time was running out. His body had become frailer, and the energy he once had was slowly fading. Yet, even as his health deteriorated, his spirit remained unbroken. The dog still made his way to the gates each day, still sat at his usual spot by the tarmac, waiting for planes to land. His steps were heavy now, and sometimes his body would shake from the effort, but he never stopped. He was driven by a force stronger than the physical exhaustion. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held that same intensity, the same hope that he had when he was a young pup. Every day, he would position himself by the gate, watching the planes land, his heart still skipping a beat at the sight of each one. His legs wobbled with the effort, but he would stand up, tail wagging faintly, eyes scanning the passengers as they disembarked. Sometimes, he would follow someone for a few steps, only to realize it wasn't his owner. The disappointment would hit him hard, but he wouldn't give up. He never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that one day, the person he had waited for all these years would finally step off the plane. His health might have been failing, but the bond he had with his owner kept him going. It was a bond that had endured the passage of time, the endless wait, and the harshest of conditions. Every aching muscle, every labored breath was a small price to pay for the chance that one day He would be reunited with the person he had loved and trusted more than anything. No matter how weak his body became, his heart was still strong, his hope as powerful as ever. As his body grew weaker, the airport became less of a place of endless searching and more of a symbol of his undying loyalty. He was there, every single day, his heart still beating for the one person who had once loved him. One particularly quiet morning, as the dog sat by the familiar gates, watching the planes come and go, something inside him shifted. The usual excitement that filled him every time a plane landed had begun to fade, replaced by something deeper, something heavier. He had grown used to the pattern, the routine, searching, hoping, running after every new passenger. But today, for the first time in years, he stopped. His eyes no longer scanned the crowd with the same intensity. The excitement that once made his heart race had given way to a slow, aching realization. He wasn't just waiting for his owner anymore. He had been searching for so long, for so many years, that the edges of his memories had blurred. The scent of his owner, once so vivid, had faded into the wind. The dog had forgotten what it felt like to be held in his owner's arms, to walk side by side, to feel the warmth of that love. Now, the hope he clung to so desperately was tinged with doubt. His body had grown weak, and his mind began to ask questions that had long been buried beneath the surface. Why was he left behind? The dog had never understood what happened that day at the airport. He had been told to wait, to stay, and he had. But why hadn't his owner returned? There had been no explanation, no closure. His heart still longed for the familiar figure, but now, in the quiet solitude of the terminal, a deeper ache settled in. The question, once unspoken, now echoed louder with every plane that landed. Why did his owner leave him? The dog's mind churned with these questions as he sat there, staring at the busy terminal, the same terminal where he had waited for so long. Was the search worth it if there was no answer? Had his owner simply forgotten him? Or was there something more? A cold weight began to fill his chest, a sense of doubt that he had never allowed himself to feel. But even in the midst of this crushing realization, the dog didn't give up. He still needed to know. He still needed closure. Even if the reunion he had longed for never came, he had to understand what had happened. And so, with renewed determination, the dog continued his search. This time, it wasn't just about finding his owner. It was about finding the answers he had been seeking for all these years. One day, something extraordinary happened. Something that set the dog's heart racing like never before. It began as a faint whisper on the wind, an unfamiliar scent carried on the air, but to the dog it was as if the world had stopped. His nose twitched as he sniffed the ground, his ears flicked forward, and his eyes widened with recognition. This scent, this was different. It wasn't like any other. This was his owner's scent. For the first time in years, the dog felt a surge of hope that flooded his chest. The scent was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakable. He hadn't imagined it. The dog's body froze, and for a long moment he stood there, staring at the plane that had just landed, its massive body rolling into place on the tarmac. The scent had come from that direction, from the plane. His instincts told him he had found something real. This was no coincidence. Without a second thought, the dog began to move, his legs moving faster than they had in years, carrying him toward the plane. His heart pounded in his chest as he followed the scent, weaving through the terminal, past the travelers who barely noticed him, past the airport staff who had seen him before, but thought nothing of him. The dog was laser-focused now. This was it. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The airport administration had noticed his sudden urgency as he sprinted through the halls, but they didn't understand what was happening. They had grown used to the dog's eccentric behavior, but this was different. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was following something real, something that could lead him to his owner. But to the airport workers, it was just another strange moment involving the elusive stray dog. The dog pushed through the crowd, getting closer and closer to the area where the plane had docked. His body ached, his legs growing more fatigued, but he ignored it. The scent was getting stronger. He was so close now. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself held its breath. The dog's heart beat like thunder in his chest as he approached the flight attendants and baggage handlers unloading the passengers. He had found the scent, and now he was following it, with a determination stronger than ever. The dog's instincts, his years of waiting, had finally paid off. He had a lead. He was no longer just hoping. He was on the trail, and he knew he couldn't stop now. The airport staff had no idea what was happening, but the dog did. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The answer he sought was closer than ever. The dog's energy was nearly gone. His once strong legs now trembled with exhaustion, and his frail body seemed to protest with every step he took. But the scent, the unmistakable scent of his owner, was still there, faint but clear enough to follow. He had closed the distance, inch by inch, desperate to find the person he had been waiting for all these years. His paws slapped against the terminal floor, his body aching, but his heart thumped with purpose. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The scent led him through a maze of corridors, past security checkpoints, and into the deepest parts of the airport. The staff, oblivious to his mission, continued their duties, but the dog was unstoppable now. Every time he thought he couldn't go any further, another burst of energy surged through him, urging him forward, pulling him toward his goal. The closer he got, the more real it all became. He was almost there. Then, as he rounded a corner, something unexpected happened. A sudden surge of noise and movement filled the space ahead. He had reached a restricted area where passengers were being directed toward their baggage claim. His body, driven by instinct, pushed forward faster than it had in weeks, as though this was the moment he had been waiting for. He darted past workers, his fur brushing against their legs, narrowly avoiding being caught. His eyes were locked on the crowd ahead, scanning desperately for that familiar figure. He could feel the scent pulling him closer, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of his exhaustion seemed to lift. It was as if the sheer will to find his owner had reignited a spark within him, a final burst of hope that propelled him forward with more strength than he had known he had left. His pace quickened, his heart racing, faster and faster as the realization hit him. His owner was so close. In that moment, the world seemed to fade away. The bustling airport, the workers shouting at him to stop, the passengers moving past him, it all blurred into the background. All that mattered was the scent that led him forward, pulling him toward the person who had once been his everything. He wasn't just chasing a dream anymore. He was chasing the one thing that had kept him alive for all these years, the chance to be reunited with the one person who had left him behind. This was the thrilling chase that would define everything. The dog was closing in, and he could feel it in his bones. He was almost there. The dog's heart raced as he neared the final stretch of his journey. His legs were barely holding him up, each step a challenge, but he could sense it. He was so close. The scent, unmistakable and filled with memories, grew stronger with each breath he took. He darted around corners, slipping through crowds, his focus narrowing to the single goal ahead of him. And then, there he was. Amid the sea of passengers, standing near the baggage claim, was a man who looked so familiar, the figure that had haunted his dreams for years. The dog's heart surged with hope, his tail wagging feebly as he took a cautious step forward, his breath quickening with excitement. The man had his back turned, oblivious to the dog's presence. Yet, the dog recognized him instantly. The years apart had done nothing to erase the bond they shared. His owner was there, standing just a few feet away, and the dog could hardly contain himself. With a burst of energy, the dog surged forward, his legs trembling, but his heart certain. He reached the man and stopped in front of him, eyes wide, face filled with longing. For a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The noise of the airport faded away. It was just the dog, his owner, and the profound silence between them. The dog stood there, waiting, tail wagging more vigorously now, as if to say, "I've been waiting for you. I never gave up." But the man didn't recognize him. His eyes scanned the dog, confused, unable to place him. The dog's heart sank for a split second, a pang of disappointment as the man stared blankly at him. Had time and distance erased everything? Was the bond they once shared truly gone? And then it happened. The man's face shifted from confusion to realization. His eyes widened and a rush of recognition flooded through him. Slowly, he crouched down, reaching out to the dog, his voice breaking as he whispered, You're still here. It's you." The man's hands trembled as he stroked the dog's head, his voice thick with emotion. The dog's heart soared. The love he had held onto for so long, the loyalty that had never wavered, was finally answered. The reunion wasn't just a moment of joy. It was a testament to the dog's unwavering spirit, to the bond that had survived time, distance, and heartache. The airport, the crowds, the years. They all melted away as the dog and his owner shared that brief but powerful moment. Tears welled up in the man's eyes as he hugged the dog, and for the first time in 4 years, the dog felt the warmth of his owner's arms around him. It was a reunion that would never be forgotten, a moment that defined the depth of love, loyalty, and never giving up. The dog's heart raced as he neared the final stretch of his journey. His legs were barely holding him up, each step a challenge, but he could sense it. He was so close. The scent, unmistakable and filled with memories, grew stronger with each breath he took. He darted around corners, slipping through crowds, his focus narrowing to the single goal ahead of him. And then, there he was. Amid the sea of passengers, standing near the baggage claim, was a man who looked so familiar, the figure that had haunted his dreams for years. The dog's heart surged with hope, his tail wagging feebly as he took a cautious step forward, his breath quickening with excitement. The man had his back turned, oblivious to the dog's presence. Yet, the dog recognized him instantly. The years apart had done nothing to erase the bond they shared. His owner was there, standing just a few feet away, and the dog could hardly contain himself. With a burst of energy, the dog surged forward, his legs trembling but his heart certain. He reached the man and stopped in front of him, eyes wide, face filled with longing. For a moment, everything around them seemed to disappear. The noise of the airport faded away. It was just the dog, his owner, and the profound silence between them. The dog stood there, waiting, tail wagging more vigorously now, as if to say, "I've been waiting for you. I never gave up." But the man didn't recognize him. His eyes scanned the dog, confused, unable to place him. The dog's heart sank for a split second, a pang of disappointment as the man stared blankly at him. Had time and distance erased everything? Was the bond they once shared truly gone? And then it happened. The man's face shifted from confusion to realization. His eyes widened and a rush of recognition flooded through him. Slowly, he crouched down, reaching out to the dog, his voice breaking as he whispered, You're still here. It's you." The man's hands trembled as he stroked the dog's head, his voice thick with emotion. The dog's heart soared. The love he had held onto for so long, the loyalty that had never wavered, was finally answered. The reunion wasn't just a moment of joy. It was a testament to the dog's unwavering spirit, to the bond that had survived time, distance, and heartache. The airport, the crowds, the years. They all melted away as the dog and his owner shared that brief but powerful moment. Tears welled up in the man's eyes as he hugged the dog, and for the first time in 4 years, the dog felt the warmth of his owner's arms around him. It was a reunion that would never be forgotten, a moment that defined the depth of love, loyalty, and never giving up. As the man held the dog, the weight of their separation began to lift, replaced by the warmth of their reunion. The air around them was thick with unspoken words, words that would never fully capture the depth of what they had both endured. But there was no need for words anymore. The dog's tired eyes reflected the same unwavering love that had never faltered, even after all the years apart. And in that moment, the man understood. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how far they had been separated, this bond between them had always existed, waiting to be rekindled. With a final, lingering look into the dog's eyes, the man stood up, helping the dog to his feet. There was no rush, no hurry. The reunion had taken years, and now they could take their time. They walked together, side by side, the airport behind them. The noise, the rush of people, the confusion, it all faded away as they stepped outside, into the open air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the world. The soft breeze stirred the dog's fur, and the man could feel the quiet, peaceful rhythm of their steps. Together, finally, the man's heart swelled with a new sense of purpose. It was as if the weight of all those years of guilt, regret, and unanswered questions had been lifted. They were free now, free to live the life they had both lost. As they walked toward the horizon, the last rays of sunlight bathed them in a golden glow, painting a picture of hope. The dog, once so lost and alone, now walked with a sense of belonging. And the man, once consumed by his mistakes, now felt whole again. They had faced the hardships of separation, the pain of the unknown, and the cruel weight of time. But their bond, the unbreakable thread between them, had withstood it all. Together, they moved forward, into the unknown, but with the certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. The journey had been long, but it was only just beginning. And as they walked off into the sunset, the dog's tired eyes sparkled with a quiet joy, knowing that the love he had waited for was finally, truly, his again.